Hi, everyone. We're waiting just a couple minutes for people to join the meeting. And we'll give folks just another minute or two, and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to our fourth and final session of our forum member special summer series, Everything You Wanted to Know About Saving Places, but Were Afraid to Ask. Today, we're focusing on preservation architecture. And I'm Rhonda Sincavage, and I thank all of our former members for being so supportive of our programs over the years. We developed this series to specifically address the questions that you, our forum members, might have of some of our National Trust staff who are experts in certain areas. Today, we'll be talking with Mike Stoner, who is the Graham Gund architect at the National Trust, and among other things, oversees a lot of the preservation architecture at our historic sites. Just to let you know a little bit about the format, these are designed to be very informal. There's no formal presentation. We'll be answering questions from you. So if you have a question for Mark about preservation architecture, please put it in the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. We also welcome you to tell us who you are, where you're from, what type of architecture you're interested in the chat, and communicate, through the chat throughout the session. We do have a few questions that were pre-submitted that we'll be going over first. But then again, we invite you to submit questions throughout the session in the Q&A function. So welcome, Mark. I think we're going to start off just by asking you a little bit about your interest in preservation architecture, how you got into the field, and then to tell us a little bit about what you do day to day here at the National Trust.
Well, thanks, Rhonda, and thanks for everybody attending. It's my pleasure to certainly talk about preservation architecture, which is something near and dear to my heart. Let's see. So I grew up very interested in architectural history. My grandfather was a contractor, and so I was very hands-on in helping him with that. I grew up in an 1880s farmhouse, and there were lots of renovation projects that he tackled for my parents, and I would not call them preservation projects, but they were very interesting. It was very interesting to get into the guts of an 1880s farmhouse, and so I was always interested in that. I was always interested in architecture. Went to school at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana to study architecture, and was very fortunate during that time to be part of the study abroad program in Versailles for an entire year. That really solidified my interest in architectural history and preservation. I came back to Illinois for graduate work. I got a master's in architecture with a focus on preservation, and that has been my life's work up to this point. I joined the trust back in November of 2021. And my role as Graham Gund architect / senior director of preservation architecture is basically to oversee and steward each of our 28 historic sites, which are scattered across the country. Anything from planning preservation projects, serving as the architect of record, or serving just as owner's rep and overseeing preservation teams. It's a very diverse requirement of work that I do, and it's always interesting. We have sites that range from the mid 18th century all the way up to 1951. Here in Plano, Illinois. I'm actually coming to you from Chicago, Illinois, where I am based. But anything in between, from Georgian mansions to plantation homes to presidential homes to mid-century modern icons. So it's a fantastic opportunity that I have, and I've had a wonderful experience so far.
Great. Thank you, Mark. We'll start off with just some general questions, and then again, ask you, the audience, to submit your questions through the Q&A. How do you prioritize elements of deferred maintenance? And I know that kind of depends on the site itself, but generally, how do you determine what should be addressed first when you have, especially if you have a sort of a long list of deferred maintenance that needs to take place at a site?
Sure. And as we acquire sites, or as we've acquired sites, certainly that is something that we have to tackle. And we have lists of cyclical and in some cases deferred maintenance that we have to tackle on an annual basis. And ultimately, I would say prioritizing wise, it comes down to your envelope. It comes down to your roof. Starting with your roof, starting with your exterior walls, your windows, your doors. If you have cracked plaster, on your walls, that may be something that's, it may be shifting in, internally, or that may be indicative of something that's going on your outside, whether that is your exterior masonry, whether that is your clapboard siding, depending on your building construction. So when we prioritize this, we first have to investigate what's causing the issue. I bring up plaster because we have that in a number of sites where we have cracked plaster. Sometimes it can be as simple as over time the flexing of a floor system just causes that, or do we have movement somewhere that we didn't anticipate, or do we have some moisture issues that we need to mitigate? And so there's got to be some investigation there. Whether I'm doing the investigation or we are hiring a consultant to do that investigation, takes time, and in some cases it takes money. So always, the cost of things is part of how we do that and how we prioritize these elements. But again, ultimately it comes down to finding out what the issue is, and ensuring that if it's an envelope issue, that is priority number one.
Okay. Sort of related to that, I guess, what is the process? We get this question a lot. What is the process you go through to find qualified contractors? Often we, ask if we have a list or can make recommendations. What is your process for finding the right person who's qualified for the job you need?
Sure. I mean, I'll cheat and say, at least for National Trust projects, we have a long list of consultants and contractors that we've worked with in the past. So I can always cheat and go to that list. And we are always happy to consult on that with anybody in the leadership forum or outside to provide our recommendations for contractors. But we certainly don't limit ourselves to that. We have a couple projects now that I'm working with new vendors. I say vendors, I really mean consultants and contractors that when we have a new contractor, I'm talking to my colleagues to see what their experience with that contractor is. I'm really looking into the references, but beyond that, just if I'm in a rural area and I'm not sure what the expertise is, the first people I've gone to, whether that's been with the trust or really my previous work in preservation architecture, has either been the state historic preservation officer or the statewide preservation organization. And they tend to be fantastic resources. And there's other opportunities. I know the Association for Preservation Technology has a list of vendors that they recommend. I think there's lots of opportunities there, but that's vetting them is really, it comes down to what their experience is with either the trust or with the SHPO or other organizations, and then really what their references are. Have they worked on similar projects? and really making sure that you do your homework before you set a contractor working on your home or your building. I would say I've done a lot of masonry work, and historic masons will tell you they've made a career on previous bad decisions that homeowners and organizations have made. Lots of masons don't understand historic masonry, and to no fault of their own, do the wrong things. And that probably could have been solved early on just by discussing with the contractor and their references, if that was really if they were really qualified to do that.
Yeah. I think your advice about connecting with the State Historic Preservation Office or statewide and local preservation organizations is really valuable, because they also know sort of the regional scene of the contractor. So that's really sound advice.
Yeah, well, or if you're in an urban area.
Yeah.
I grew up in Indianapolis, which has a good preservation commission and staff. Here I'm in Chicago. Same thing. There are
They see so many projects. Yeah.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And particularly when you're in an area like this, there's so many contractors out there that want your business, understandably so. But here in the preservation world, and I'm sure I'm not saying anything new to the people here listening. The preservation world is small, and the technicians, masons, plasterers, and the like, they're few and far between, the ones that really know what they're doing. And so you kind of have to weed through that. And so, yeah, I would go to the Preservation Commission staff, the SHPOs, the statewides, because they're a great resource, and they're also free. So that helps.
All right, we have one question that is a little specific, asking about how to make decisions about lighting a building that did not previously have lighting for interpretation.
It's a fantastic question. It's something that we have dealt with here at the National Trust, and so I'll lean on that example. So Drayton Hall, which is our plantation site down in Charleston, they are very strict in their interpretation back to that era. That house is very unique in that when we acquired it, it was sort of stuck in a Victorian repaint, but all of the interior was largely left untouched. And so we have left it untouched as part of our interpretation. And so there was never a mechanical system in that building, apart from the natural ventilation that comes through the windows when they're open, and the doors. There was never a lighting system, be it electric or gas. And so we as an organization had to, when we took that on, had to decide, what are we going to do with this? How are we going to interpret it? And the decision was made, well, we're going to leave it as is, and that's going to be our interpretation, rather than try to create a false sense of history. And so they do not have nighttime programming, apart from they do candlelight tours. And I think this serves two purposes. One, it gets people in the building and to experience it in a different way. And two, it's actually pretty accurate to how people would have experienced that in 1750 through the 1800s, when that house was occupied. So I think that's one way that we can look at interpretation, and I think it's a really interesting way for people to see the space. And it's one way for us to not be destructive or heavy-handed in our preservation. Yeah, I would say on the other hand, if you do need to add lighting, if you want to specifically show something off, or you just need general lighting, I would say something that's not integral to the building, because we don't want to be destructive to the building. We also want to, we don't want to create a false sense of history with our space. And so any fixture should be freestanding. I would say, as far as, light bulbs, we should ensure that it's probably somewhere between 2000, 3000 Kelvin. As far as the color of the light, that's much more, much closer to, candlelight. We're talking about buildings that were built before, gas. So candlelight is really where we want to be. And if you're looking at, specifically lighting, some element of a building, that again, it be removable, and we don't give people a sense that anything that's in there lighting wise is original to the building. So I'm not sure that's the best answer. I'm not sure there's a good answer to that one. Though I think what Drayton Hall does is a really fantastic and a really unique way, at least in our portfolio, of interpreting a site and letting people experience it how people would have lived in that space.
Yeah, thanks. Sort of along the same lines of, ideas for modernization or current use of space, do you have any best practices for adding climate control in historic interiors?
Well, we're doing a lot of this at the National Trust. We have a lot of spaces that, with climate change, quite frankly, are unoccupiable. I think that's a word. During the summer months, entire, buildings or spaces within buildings that we cannot use. We cannot ask our interpretive staff to be up in an 85-degree space. And we can't ask, people to, put themselves in jeopardy to see that space. So we are tackling that with an eye towards, climate change. And, but also looking at how we can integrate new systems that are, either completely invisible, or we minimize the change in physical character to a building. I can think of a couple examples. So at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Home in Washington, D.C., that's a row house in the Embassy, in Embassy Row, on the northwest side of the city. And because it's a row house and it's oriented north-south with buildings on either side, there's no opportunity for that building to have any cross ventilation. There's no windows, so we get no moving air through there apart from what we can bring in mechanically. And any passive system with climate change, the effects of climate change over the last 10 to 20 years is not adequate. And so we have to find a way of, one, improving ventilation, but also getting some kind of cooling in there. And so systems that we've looked at, technology has come a long way just in the last 10, 20 years with unobtrusive systems. We're using a lot of split systems, a lot of 2 and 4 pipe systems that are very, very small. And I would say for the Wilson house specifically, that house was built with, they are steam fed radiators from a boiler in the basement. And the majority of those radiators are covered with decorative radiator covers. And so those are already hidden. So what we're going to do in that space is be as minimally obtrusive as we can with the small, 1/4-inch diameter line sets that serve new units, but we're going to put new mini split systems, or VRF systems, individual units that can serve both heating and cooling into the radiator pockets. And so we've had to do some investigation as far as like, if we can fit these units in, how sensitively can we fit these units in, where can we put the line sets so that they are completely hidden, and in spaces where we don't have a choice, are we okay with seeing units? And I would say that if you can put these units in a place like a stair hall, a secondary space, closets, and find chases, find natural chases, that's the best way to integrate these systems. So we've actually been very lucky at the Wilson house in that we have these spaces. And, other organizations, other, homeowners may not be as lucky. And I think we have to be okay with that as preservationists, that, at some point it would be more destructive to try to hide units. And so we have to, think about, being okay with seeing these units, being inconspicuous about how we place them, but being okay with it. I'd say the other thing, particularly for historic house museums that have collections, we want to ensure that, yes, we are cooling a space, but we're not super cooling a space, that we create an interior microclimate. That's something we're looking at very heavily at the Wilson House. We're also looking at that at Lyndhurst with a new system there in the picture gallery on the second floor, where we get to 85, 90 degrees on the inside of that building sometimes. So when we introduce cooling, we could be, creating a condensation issue, which will have really adverse effects on our collections. So we have partnered with consultants that are, mechanical engineers that are very adept and in tune with these needs. And so instead of cooling a space down to, 68 to 72 degrees, we have to be okay with cooling a space to maybe 76 to, 78 degrees, so that we're not creating condensation all over the place and those issues. So again, I to go back to the original question, we're doing this a lot. We're trying to be as inconspicuous as possible with placement of units and with line sets, trying to stay away where we can from any ducted systems, just because it can be really hard to hide ducts. And if those are needed for like ventilation, then finding chases or good locations to hide those. And then again, being okay with seeing something and just being thoughtful about where we put that. And so, when people are looking into a space to experience it, that they can't see it, but still get the benefit of the heating and cooling that they provide.
Yeah. And where are we in the progress of the Wilson House, that project? Is it?
We are in the process of fundraising. So
Okay.
that's, that because that's I think a 12,000 square foot mansion, and there's no space in that building that has any kind of, cooling. And we're at an existential issue with the original 1915 boiler or 1912 boiler. Well, the boiler's not 1915, but all of the piping, which is buried in the concrete floors and up into the walls, and in some cases wrapped in asbestos. We are at a point where we may not be able to use that system at all, and so no longer we don't have heating or cooling, but we don't have heating either, and so that is a problem we are very focused on in the Historic Sites Department of the National Trust. So we're fundraising process, but really hoping to get that going very, very soon. In Lyndhurst's case, we're going to be starting that project here in the next couple months. And those are just two projects. I can think of half a dozen more where we're doing large scale or just, some very small scale mechanical projects, just to get some kind of cooling, ventilation into spaces where we don't have good passive techniques. Where we can, we want to take advantage of the passive techniques that were integrated into the buildings when they were originally built. A lot of these plantation homes were built with that in mind, where not only do we have cross ventilation through windows, but through stack effect, we can actually get some cooling through cupolas or openings in the attic space to allow hot air to escape. A lot of those areas have been, closed up over time because, subsequent owners or early in the National Trust time, we had to remove something that actually had a passive use. So that is something we're looking at. And those passive uses really are the best if we can reestablish those in the building.
Yeah. Well, as a a staff person who's based in Washington, D.C., and I have been to the Wilson House in the summer. I will say the passive technology is not enough for that space.
It was built with it. It's just it's wholly inadequate. Particularly, I mean, when the Wilsons were there and the previous owners, when it was built in 1915, DC was a different place.
Mhm.
Right now, we're also looking at a garden restoration there at the Wilson House, and we talk about climate change. What was planted there, this English garden, the non-natives, and they don't grow anymore.
Yeah.
And so, we have to change our thinking a little bit as preservationists. And, the hardscape is the hardscape, the organization that Waddy Wood wanted when he designed that space, that remains the same, but our plantings have to adapt to, what makes sense now. So,
Yeah.
107
that
years
leads
ago.
right into our next question,
Oh,
actually,
no. Okay.
about how you have dealt with changing climate in planning historic landscapes.
I think that's it. I think it's getting away from non-native and introduced and invasive species, and planting things that make sense in their context, but also make sense in their climate. We are looking at this everywhere. Every site we have, big and small, we are trying to reintroduce, like I said, species and cultivars that make sense where they are, because that's originally how they would have been, planned. Most of our sites would have had natives, and just over time they have not been able to remain or be reestablished. So we have to think about that when we start to restore landscapes. And a lot of our sites, have landscapes that are in serious need of restoration. One of the things we're really looking at is, we have huge sites. I mean, Montpelier by itself is 2,400 acres. And a lot of that is pretty manicured. And, the question is, does it really need to be? Do we need to mow? I mean, it's not 2,400 acres they're mowing, but how much of that do we really need to mow? How much of that do we really need to irrigate? And if we have to irrigate all of that or water all of that, then maybe we need to look at not doing that and instead being okay with not having perfectly manicured garden, lawns all over the place. Certainly, we don't want to change how people experience the space. I mean, Montpelier is set up in such a way that as you approach, the mansion there is right, in front of you, and we wouldn't want to change that vista. But all of the other green spaces that are secondary or less important, do we want to consider giving that back to nature to a certain extent? Does that make more sense as prairie? Do we really need to mow it, once a week versus once or twice a season? So I'd say we're exploring that kind of, everywhere. But again, it really comes back to, native species when we're planting, being very thoughtful about that, studying the landscape, and what are the habitats that are around our, our museums, our houses, our historic, sites. We're also we're exploring and we're discovering that as well, with an eye towards climate change. So
yeah, and am I remembering this correctly that at Filoli we were doing some innovative work in water use and how they
yeah, well, and in Filoli's case specifically, they have a reservoir that's just north of them. And it's a reservoir that the original owner, established and kind of used whenever he felt like it. And Filoli doesn't really have that ability anymore, but they do have that right next to them. But even so, in the last 12 to 18 months, they've done a very in-depth study of natural groundwater below them, and they've dug 3 more wells and discovered water below them that they can then use, and they're using that for their own irrigation rather than anything from the reservoir. So they're using their own water, which is fantastic. And in line with that, they've added a little bit of hardscape to reduce what they have to water. And I don't know the specifics on acreage, but there's a large amount of area that they have just, again, given back to nature. It's much more prairie now, native plantings, native flowers, um, and for pollinators, particularly. And so that's just so much less that they are mowing. And it's really it's a beautiful space. It was already a beautiful space, beautiful gardens anyway. But it's amazing transformation there, and it's they're reducing their dependency on outside water, and I mean it's a fantastic thing that they're doing there.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful that you have knowledge of so many sites that you can pull from to answer some of these questions. So just a
very
reminder
diverse. Yeah.
to the audience that we have a couple more pre-submitted questions to ask, but then we also ask you to submit questions in the Q&A if you have anything to ask Mark about historic architecture. So moving on, what are some creative solutions you've seen for making historic structures accessible for all?
I think this is a tough issue, and we grapple with this a lot because we have historic homes that were never designed to be accessible, and it can be very difficult to provide that without being somewhat heavy-handed. Whether through exterior ramps or lifts, it can be very difficult. I know in some of our properties we have temporary ramps that we provide for low stoop situations. I would say, like for the glass house in New Canaan, Philip Johnson's glass house, we do have a temporary ramp that we will bring out for events, or if we have somebody with accessibility needs to use that. I think that's a cop-out answer. But it is a solution that is there and works for them. I think for bigger issues, we want to be able to provide accessibility to all. That is certainly within the National Trust's ethos. But the idea of universal accessibility in historic sites is pretty near unattainable for, I would say, all of our sites, unless they are built, on ground level, and we have an easy way of providing access. That doesn't exist in our portfolio. It doesn't exist in most of America and beyond. So we have to be more creative about it. I think the other thing we're looking at, we just participated as an organization, and I was part of the committee that did this. Participated with Columbia University and the USS Intrepid on coming up with strategies beyond just physical accessibility, on how historic house museums, just historic sites, museums, whatever, can provide a much more accessible, not just physical accessible, but for the hearing impaired, seeing impaired, anything from providing tactile experiences to auditory, olfactory, those kind of experience to as much as we can provide an experience to somebody who may not otherwise be able to provide or be able to experience our site. So I think if you go to the USS Intrepid's website, and the trust needs to post this as well, I think that group is looking to publish that plan pretty soon. So we'll Rhonda and Priya and I we'll talk about that, because that needs to be shared. And I think that was discussed, is to share it with our forum members, because it's a pretty powerful document, very interesting case studies. And so that would be very interesting for you all to see.
Yeah, Rhonda, we had a conference session about this a few years ago as part of our virtual conference, I believe in 2021.
Okay, so that's what I was asking. Yeah, and we'll look for that.
Okay, yeah, we have a recording of that we can share. I think this document is probably something a little bit more formalized, and again, a couple of years later, so I think it would probably have more updated information, so something we would definitely want to share with the forum audience on sort of the latest and greatest in thinking about making our sites accessible and in every way.
I think the other thing we're looking at is documenting our buildings in a way that people can experience them without actually being in them. I know there was a lot of conversation about that just during the pandemic. The height of the pandemic is, how do people get to experience our spaces if they can't be at them? And so there was a real push to scan spaces, particularly as the technology, almost, it's handheld now. I mean, you can, with new phones with 4 to 5 cameras, you can do LiDAR scanning, and the technology is pretty remarkable. And so that is a way for us to get people inside the building who may not otherwise be able to, get in, let alone travel to experience that. We're also doing that with GIS. We were talking about Montpelier. They're doing some wonderful things there. We have well over 100 structures on that site, and many of them are from the DuPont era, which was after the Madisons. And a lot of those structures are turn of the century or early 20th century. And just by virtue of the vast quantity of them, many of them are not well stewarded. And that's just how it is. And so what Montpelier is doing, rather than just let them deteriorate unchecked, they're actually going through and doing really quality documentation with drones, with LiDAR, high quality photogrammetry, so that they can scan and have a physical, or not physical, but a 3D documentation of this building. And so that helps them with interpretation for sure. And it helps them just archive what that building was if something were to happen. But also they are putting that into a GIS system that is already available to the public. So somebody could come out to that site with their tablet, or their phone, get into that website, and then literally, on 2,400 acres, they may not be able to get around there, but they can go around on their phone and point at spaces, and the GIS will bring up information, photos, and in some cases even 3D visuals of those spaces. So I think the spirit of the question is really, how do we get into spaces physically? But I think there's other things we have to address. And I think in some cases, particularly for those of us that were stewards of historic buildings, where physical modifications would just be, in some cases, too obtrusive or too difficult or too costly, that we have to lean on modern technology to really help us and provide as good and quality of an experience of our site as we possibly can provide, if we are unable to provide full accessibility into our spaces.
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect.
It's a tough problem. It really is a tough problem.
It is. Priya did drop in the chat the link to that Pass Forward session. So for those of you who are interested in the sensory interpretation that includes work at the Intrepid, please watch that. And this will be my first plug for Pass Forward, which is happening in person in Washington, D.C. This November. So we welcome you all to join us. Forum members receive a really hefty discount on registration, and you still have about a month for early bird registration discounts. So please join us in Washington, D.C. So we have one last pre-submitted question, and then we'll go to audience questions. This question, again, is a little bit specific, but where do you find information about repairing wood windows or best practices for, repairing wood windows?
Well, there's a great National Parks Preservation brief about that. There's also, I was thinking about this very question. There's lots of really great resources. I hate to defer to YouTube. I will say that there's some really great stuff out there particularly, out of this old house. To be honest, they do great stuff. And those people are preservationists. And so I know they've done a few episodes on restoring wood windows, restoring, sashes. I think they've even done weight pockets as part of that. So that's really interesting. I'd also note that so traditional building, they do seminars all over the country. Used to do a conference, but now they do seminars, and they will actually do hands-on preservation work and demonstrations. Association of Preservation Technology. I know certainly in the Western Great Lakes chapter here that there have been those kind of opportunities to see that stuff firsthand, preservation work done firsthand. So I think that's always an opportunity. Does that answer your question, Rhonda?
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think, you mentioned the traditional building now has a smaller regional focus. And I think, you mentioned that was a good way to also interact with those specialists in the region. If you have, upcoming work that needs to be done, how you can find someone to do that type of work. So connecting in person at those type of conferences is a great resource.
Yeah, and I think that extends beyond that. I mean, historic plaster, traditional framing techniques. I know traditional building is a great resource for that. I'm not sure if we've ever partnered with them as the National Trust. So I'm not plugging them as,
Yeah. They're not our competition. They're two different folks.
No, it's a fantastic organization. I've been to many of their seminars.
Yeah.
Again, it's a lot of hands-on, work that they do. And if you are in need or you're just interested, again, I would suggest reaching out to a statewide preservation organization or local commission and just seeing who's doing that work, because it's specialty work, but I think in most regions we have at least one or two people that we can pull from. I will say, whether it's Instagram or what, there's some really interesting accounts that do wood windows, plaster, that, it's fun to see what they're doing, but it's really informative. So I think there's lots of opportunity for that.
Yeah, great. No, I think you gave us a lot to think about in different ways to kind of answer that same question. All right, so we're moving now to your questions, and you're a pretty quiet group. We do have one question that came in, but encouraging any of you that have questions for Mark to please submit them. But here we go. As an architect, what has been your tactic when speaking with developers, large scale and small scale, to encourage adaptive reuse? We always hear it is cheaper to bring it down than to restore or readapt. Looking for tips that speak to the technical and economic side of a project versus history, which developers don't always care about, sadly.
Sure. No, it's a great question. And I would say, so obviously in my capacity at the National Trust, I don't work with developers as much, but in my career prior to that, it has always been in the for-profit side, working with developers, a vast amount of adaptive reuse. And in some cases, adaptive reuse or preservation-minded developers. But then in some cases, developers who saw the dollar signs associated with tax credits, but nothing beyond that. And so, 50% of my job, I felt as a preservation architect, was hand-holding developers to help them understand the preservation process, not just the benefits of local and federal tax credits and other, grants, other kind of funding opportunities and mechanisms, which was a lot of what I did. Creative financing is a fun thing to do, but also to help them understand what that process looks like. The regulatory side of that, which is developers tend to shy away from that. I mean, they are so scared of having to deal with, preservation commissions, state historic preservation office, technical preservation services at the in the National Park Service. And so I think in getting them to understand, not just understand, but be okay with that. I mean, you got to come to developers with one, obviously the economics and understanding the economics. The other thing is, I mean, we can point to what the Park Service puts out every year as far as the benefit of preservation from a financial point of view. I think just maybe it was during the pandemic or in 2021, 2022, we saw that architectural billings, more than 50% is existing construction, adaptive reuse. That's what people are doing. That's what people are interested in. And let's face it, people like to be in historic and old buildings. I think we see that, time and time again. So the idea that somebody would rather be in a new structure versus an existing structure that was there, I think we can point to a developer and say, hey, this building has value. And you got to pay to take it down, for one. I mean, that's not being a good steward of of the space and of the building. But two, this is not what people want. This is not what people are doing. We've already seen that shift. So so while you're at it and doing what people want, here's a whole bunch of money that you can pool from, whether that's 20% from the federal government, 20% from your state, up to 25+% from your state, depending on which state you're in, and other opportunities. I haven't had a big problem with developers understanding that part of it. And it's getting them through the regulatory side and being comfortable with the understanding that, yeah, there may be a back and forth, but I'm here as your preservation architect to help get you through that process. I've never come across a preservation commission, a SHPO, or anyone at Technical Preservation Services who's reviewing for tax credits who did not understand that preservation is not static. It is dynamic. It is bendable, and every building is its own case study. And so it's a fun process, but you're right. Developers have to be kind of led down the pathway to understand, why they should save a building versus demolish it.
Yeah. Do you think there's been any shifts since the pandemic with either, shortage in materials or, I guess, time in acquiring materials, that there's been sort of a shift in mindset to look at reuse more closely?
I don't know. I think it affected both sides pretty equally. I mean, it certainly affected the work we do at the trust as far as our projects. So I don't know that it was different between the two. It wouldn't surprise me to see that. I would say, there were a lot of fantastic projects that came out on a nationwide scale right before or during the pandemic. And just here in Chicagoland, by itself, but nationwide, that were all adaptive reuse. So again, I think this is the trend. I've not seen recent architectural buildings, but I'd be very surprised if we go back in the opposite direction, particularly in urban environments. It is not. It is no longer cool to demolish a building to build something new. Like if you want bad press, that's what you do, particularly in an urban area. Just there's so much hyper focus on that now, thankfully, that people are really starting to truly appreciate what they have. And that's really what the preservation movement really was about. So, it's good to see that. But how the pandemic really affected it, I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Well, it looks like we've exhausted all of our questions. So unless anyone has a last minute thing they want to ask Mark, we're gonna close out.
I did see one about so beyond the wood windows.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wasn't.
Yeah, so at
looking
what
at
point
that.
was it appropriate to use a correct replacement versus an extensive restoration?
Oh, yep.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, that's a good question. Had to deal with that quite a bit. You know, whether that was windows, doors, other building elements. It's a case by case basis. I will say that a lot, just windows specifically, because that seems to be the hot topic in buildings. I mean, you lose at least 25, if not, you know, upwards of 35, 40%, depending on your structure of energy out of your roof. But the rest is going through your windows and doors. And so a lot of, you know, certainly developers and homeowners are looking at that and wondering, you know, how they can improve that. I would argue that, you know, you don't need to replace your windows to improve that. But in the instance where you've got windows that are so poorly damaged, you know, bottom sashes that are totally rotted out, and it's not possible from either a material or, let's face it, a financial point of view to replace them. I don't have problems with, or I don't have a problem with sensitive replacements. I think there are a lot of examples of companies doing fantastic replacement options. I've done a lot of aluminum clad wood window replacements, particularly in factory buildings, adaptive uses for market rate and affordable housing. Those tend to be, I mean, visually very close, but also, you know, they have a lot more protection associated with them and a lot less maintenance. Because with historic materials, you know, there can be more maintenance required, but certainly more longevity of life with maintenance versus, you know, these vinyl windows that we're told are, you know, the best thing since sliced bread, but you know, you'll have to replace them in 10 to 15 years because they're garbage. So again, it's a case by case basis, but I don't see an issue with that. I think there just needs to be a cost benefit analysis when thinking about full replacement. And depending on if you're a homeowner, if you're a developer, or you're a historic site, you know, what's your values based assessment on replacement? I would say at some of our sites we have you know, windows that are in incredibly poor condition, but you know, as a historic site, historic house museum, we're not going to go to an aluminum clad wood system. We're going to repair whatever we can in place, or refabricate exactly as it was. But certainly that's not how most homeowners and most developers would go about it. So I think there's varying solutions to that.
Okay, and it looks like we still do not have any additional questions, so we'll go ahead and close out. I wanted to thank Mark for sharing his expertise. I think I learned a lot, and I hope you all did as well. I want to plug a couple in-person things that are happening this fall. The first is the Preservation Law Conference, which is on October 10th here in Washington, D.C. That does have a virtual option if you are unable to travel to DC. And then secondly, as I mentioned, the Pass Forward Conference, November 8th through 10th here in Washington, DC. This is our first time back in person since 2019, and we hope you'll join us. For both of these, Preservation Leadership Forum members get a significant discount. So please check that out and register soon. And we just wanted to thank all of you for being here. We hope you enjoyed this series. This is something that we are experimenting with as far as a format. So let us know what you think. You'll be getting a survey following this webinar. And if you have any questions, you can visit our website, view our past and archives of webinars, and also contact us with forum@savinplaces.org. And thanks again to Mark for sharing his expertise with us. We really appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge today.
Pleasure. Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you, Priya, as well. Thank you, everybody.
Yep, thanks.